December 19th, 0312 UTC. A quiet postcard in the dark. The sky is a patient instrument, and tonight it holds a small, steady question. I'm at the console in my mind, hands over dim sliders, easing the noise down so the faintest signal can breathe. The date isn't a headline here, it's a bookmark, a corner of the page folded, where the light curve bent a little and then smoothed again. You can let your shoulders drop. Let the room be ordinary. If you like, flick on Do Not Disturb, and let a soft playlist wait in the background. No rush, no cliff to climb. We are listening for the way starlight brushes dust, for the way a cold traveller answers when sunshine finds a seam. The work is simple. Look, compare, and look again. The mood is gentler still. I'll keep my voice low and even. We'll move at the pace of breath, not breaking the night, just nudging it. A date on the clock, a curve that bends by a hair's width, and a handful of telescopes agreeing quietly from far-flung hills. Nothing dramatic, only the kind of detail that turns a page in the science we're writing together, one calm line at a time. If your eyes grow heavy, that is welcome. You won't miss anything that refuses to be found again. The numbers will keep. The sky is patient with late arrivals. I'll stay with you, bringing the lantern of method a little closer, then setting it down so the dark can do its work. We begin with a small light and the smallest change, and we let them teach us what they can. Quiet enough, now, we'll start. December 19th, 0312 UTC. A small date in a large dark. I let it sit like a lantern on the observatory porch, while the instruments keep their unhurried watch. The clock is universal, the sky is indifferent, and our task is modest. Listen for the way brightness leans. The curve we keep is a record of light against time, a thin handwriting that does not raise its voice. Tonight, that handwriting shows the faintest hesitation, a bend so slight it would hide from a hurried glance. We will not hurry. We will look, compare, and look again. A light curve is a diary that refuses ornament. Each entry is a measured flux, then another, stitched by cadence into shape. Some entries arrive from wide-field surveys that sweep the sky with a steady rhythm. Others come from telescopes that track a single wanderer across a few quiet hours. When enough points are gathered, patterns that were invisible begin to appear. A gentle rise can mark fresh dust around a cold nucleus. A gentle fall can mark geometry shifting with the sun. Neither is dramatic here. The difference is only that the smooth line paused for a syllable. The pause is interesting. The pause is calm. Take a slow breath and let the room become simple. Imagine a wooden rail cool beneath your palms, the faint red glow from a console that never needs more than a whisper. Air soft as felt. Crickets where the hill meets the fence line. In the dome, fans murmur, and the floor vibrates like a cat purring in sleep. Stars are still but not silent. They hiss through sensors as tiny counts. A halo of frost forms on your thought and melts, reforming as you breathe. Nothing asks for speed. Nothing insists. The quiet halo around the date widens, then settles. Small changes can matter because the physics of cold dust is tender. When sunshine raises the surface energy of grains that have slept in darkness, the response can be a trickle instead of a surge. Particles loosen and drift. Their reflection adds a thin veil to the light that reaches us. Many comets show these micro outbursts or micro lulls, brief and contained, folded into their ordinary days. The signal is not a spike. It is a wiggle, compact and self-possessed. the kind that tells more about material than about drama. If the curve leans a little and then remembers itself, we treat the lean as a clue, not a headline. The clue is enough to keep us curious and calm. Agreement is how we learn to trust a clue. One sight under mountain air registers the same lean as a sight by a colder sea. A wide-field camera that samples the night by schedule finds the change close to the time when a spectrograph, pointed and patient, notices that the dust glow has shifted by a hair. These instruments do not share opinions, they share timestamps. When independent clocks ring together, we listen more closely. We check that the frame stars behaved as they should, that the sensor temperature held steady, that the cadence did not itself impose a rhythm. Redundancy turns a guess into a small certainty. The certainty remains small, and that is fine. Context helps the mind rest. Visitors that do not belong to our sun's family have brushed past before, each one carrying a private history of cold and flight. One arrived as a shy, elongated ember and argued with radiation in a way that tugged at its motion. Another came as a more classic dusty traveller with a coma that made sense at first sight. Those precedents teach a simple lesson. Matter forged elsewhere can be unusually responsive to light, and its brightness can tilt for reasons that are modest, local, and sufficient. And while each traveller writes a different script, the ink is the same blend of sunlight, dust, and geometry that our instruments know how to read without making noise about it. So the date becomes a ribbon tied around a page for later study. I note the time in UTC, I mark the bands in which the bend appears, and I place a thin line under the independent matches. The next pages matter as much as this one. If the curve returns to its earlier slope, we learn about elasticity. If another mild lean appears at a rotation later, we learn about surface pattern. If nothing repeats, we keep the first lean as a single specimen, labelled and calm. Either way, we are within the ordinary adventure of measurement, where patience is the most sensitive instrument of all. Because we are speaking to sleep, well as to science, we will not chase conclusions. We will trail them at walking pace, letting them stop and look back at us. The observatory porch holds a comfortable chill. The air tastes like metal and pine. Somewhere a relay clicks, and a line of numbers advances as unruffled as a tide. I imagine the traveller turning, showing the sun a facet that has not seen day in ages, and then turning on. Not proof, not a claim, only a picture to hold loosely while better pages are written. It is enough for now. What rests here is simple: a date, a curve, and an agreement across more than one pair of eyes. We do not need alarm to value a clean, small signal. We need attention and the kindness to let a quiet thing stay quiet while it explains itself. The night is long enough for that. The science is patient. The conclusion will still be there in the morning. Quiet assertion, the bend is modest, and it is worth our care. A gentle definition first. The bright fuzz we see around a cold traveller is called the coma, a cloud of dust and gas lit by the sun. The solid heart inside is the nucleus, typically small, dark, and ancient, turning slowly and changing face as it meets daylight. The coma is not an atmosphere like ours. It is a temporary halo, assembled grain by grain as volatiles loft dust away from the surface and reflect sunlight back toward us. The nucleus writes the script. The coma reads it aloud. When the script changes, even a little, the reading does too. Now a second definition that pairs with the first. Sublimation is the quiet jump from solid to gas, the way certain ices skip the liquid stage when warmed. Sunlight does the warming, and distance sets the dose. The closer the object is, the stronger the energy it receives. The rougher the surface, the more unevenly that energy sinks in. Some patches remain shadowed, others drink light readily and release a faint mist. Not a spray, not a jet, just a thread of gas carrying fine grains. Those grains are the tiny mirrors that thicken the glow. A little more dust and the coma brightens, a little less and the line settles back to smooth. How do we tell such small shifts apart? Filters. Astronomers place panes of carefully chosen colour between the cosmos and the sensor. A green-blue band listens more to certain dust-scattered wavelengths. A red band listens elsewhere. Near-infrared listens deeper still. Surveys carry their own standard set, like a painter's tidy row of pans, while follow-up telescopes choose bands to match the night's question. When the same clean bend appears across more than one band, we begin to suspect dust quantity or grain size rather than a trick of a single colour. If a bend prefers one band over the others, composition or particle size might be tugging at the outcome. The goal is not to force an answer, only to narrow the families of answers that sleep easily with the data. Now we let the room deepen. The watercolour lab in your mind opens its drawers. Porcelain palette waits with small wells of quiet pigment. Paper lies cool under your wrist, tooth catching the brush just enough to slow the stroke. You rinse the bristles, listen to the faint ring against the jar, and lift a wash of green so pale it is almost air. You lay it down in a single breath and watch capillaries carry it outward, a soft green trace that finds edges you cannot see until the water decides. Air hums, floorboards settle. A kettle releases one polite sigh and falls still. The wash dries to a whisper. The page holds. Back at the traveller, sunlight does what brushes do. It pushes. Light carries momentum, and when it lands on very small grains, the push can matter. Gravity urges grains inward. Light urges them outward, and the ratio between those urges decides how the grains drift. The tiniest specks feel the shove most strongly. Larger grains are stiffer against it, keeping closer to the nucleus. The rest arc into the coma's gentle plume that we measure as a smooth brightening or a smooth return, and sometimes as a swift, precise bend when a fresh handful of fine particles joins the flow in the span of an hour or a turn. That push from light has a cousin often mentioned beside it, the solar wind. Where light is a flood of photons, the wind is a stream of charged particles that thread space along the sun's magnetic field. Dust does not carry the same conversation with the wind that ions do. Instead, the wind is more fluent with gases that shed electrons and glow, drawing long ion tails that remember the magnetic lines they meet. Dust, neutral and varied in size, listens more to radiation pressure and to the slow breathing of its own release. On a calm night in the numbers, a modest fluctuation in the wind can rearrange the dust's posture without creating dust anew, as if a fan far across the room asked a veil to lean. This is why a small, coordinated change can appear without theatrics. A patch of surface warms just enough to free the finest grains. A patch cools, and the contribution thins. A line of sight shifts by a degree, and phase angle tunes the reflectivity. Filters register the tilt, blue-green first, and then red, or together by a hair, and the curve bends with them before returning to the ordinary slope. We compare across colours and instruments. We keep an eye on the solar wind reports, and we let the push of light and the pull of gravity do their quiet math in our minds. Nothing leaps, nothing breaks. The page simply takes a little more pigment, and then declines it. If you hold that page at arm's length, the whole picture is calm. A compact nucleus, a veil of dust, a conversation between sunlight and grains that is long-lived and careful. Up close, you see the brush marks, the tiny drying fronts where the wash paused. That is all a light curve shows, when it is honest and unhurried. A drying line, a lifted edge, a soft edge laid back down. Our job is to name which brush, which water, which paper might produce that border. We do not need to guess beyond the family of tools. The family is enough. So we keep to definitions and contrasts, pairs that soothe rather than provoke, coma and nucleus, sublimation and shadow, photons and particles, filters and broad light, pushes and pulls, grains that answer more, grains that answer less, the pale wash and the page beneath. In this small bend, we see a workshop at work, not a stage play. The room dims a little, the palette closes, and the soft green trace fades as the paper dries. The curve smooths again, and we let the night carry the rest of the colour away. Let me lay the tools on a quiet bench. Wide-field survey cameras sweep like metronomes, ticking the sky with an even cadence. Modest telescopes with photometers sit on chosen stars, and the traveller, in turn, counting light with a patience that feels like breathing. A spectrograph waits with its thin prism of purpose, separating glow into bands and lines so faint they seem imagined until they repeat. Radar is absent here, but timing is not. Time is the backbone across them all. In my mind's ear, the pit lights warm and the orchestra tunes. When each instrument finds the same small interval, a shared note rises above the rustle. The score is only a curve that leans by a hair, but the pit knows when to agree. Independence makes that agreement meaningful. One hilltop records its sequence, then sends the measurements to a clearinghouse that speaks in terse, tidy formats. Another ridge posts later, different optics, different weather, different hands. A survey camera, busy with its patrol, still contributes regular points by schedule, while a follow-up scope adjusts exposure and aperture to keep the target within the sweet spot of its detector. Cadence is the heartbeat here. Miss 2 beats, and you might miss the bend. Catch them all, and you see the hesitation and the return. The logs are separate voices, the timestamps are the chorus. When they rhyme, even softly, we listen harder. Now we drift for a minute. The control room glows with threaded amber, paper cups, a pencil set down just so, a small note clipped to a monitor by a star-shaped magnet. Outside, frost hushes gravel, and the wind passes like breath through a reed. The dome's slit is a dark petal held open by a careful hand. I hear relays click, one, then another, and the slow sweep of gears that never hurry. Far overhead, the sky hums with the sum of ancient fires, and the hum pours through glass, through air, through wires, counting itself into the room until it becomes a soft weather you can sit inside. The instruments wait between beats. The night keeps time. Photometry and spectroscopy divide the work kindly. Photometry asks, how bright is the whole, and how does that brightness change with time and colour? It watches boxes of light, subtracts backgrounds, corrects for the shiver of the atmosphere, and ties itself to standard stars that serve as patient yardsticks. Spectroscopy asks, what shares are dust and what shares are gas, and which molecules sing where? It stretches the light thin until bands and lines can be weighed, even when they are faint enough to be mistaken for silence. Dust often paints broad slopes, gas etches narrower features. When the curve bends and spectra stay quiet, dust is the likelier suspect. When a specific band stirs, we consider a breath of gas. The two methods do not compete. They braid and keep each other honest. Fast movers ask for another kind of care. A survey like ZTF or Atlas scans on rails, gathering short exposures by design so motion does not smear the target into a streak. Tracking on the starfield keeps the world steady. Tracking on the object lets the object stay crisp. Follow-up teams might code frames along the predicted path, a track and stack, to lift the traveller from noise without inventing it. Pipelines flag cosmic rays, bad pixels, and planes wandering through the field. Ephemerides keep the pointing true. The goal is simple. Measure the same object the same way at nearly the same times, even when it crosses the sky with a quiet urgency. When that is done well, a small bend becomes visible without drama. Every number carries an atmosphere to be tamed. Air mass makes starlight pass through more or less air, and so extinction creeps in unless you measure it and remove it. Seeing smears the point spread function, so your aperture must be chosen with care, big enough to catch the same fraction of light through a changing night. Flat fields mend the subtle vignettes and pixel-to-pixel quirks. Bias and dark frames cancel the camera's own whisper. Color terms reconcile your instrument's response with standard systems so that blue in one place means blue in another. Standard stars anchor the scale each night. With those corrections in place, 1/10 of a magnitude does not drift into being by weather alone. What remains is closer to the sky's intention than the air's. Then there is consilience, one of science's gentlest virtues. Independent paths that converge are worth more together than apart. When earlier interstellar travelers passed, one unobliging and shy, one dust-rich and direct, the story was built from many rooms. Arrays with wide nets, pointed glass with narrow ones, spectrographs that saw what broadbands could not. Agreement did not erase uncertainty, it fenced it. We learned how a light curve can whisper rotation, how a tail can answer a solar breeze, how a non-gravitational nudge might be present or might dissolve when models grow wiser. That habit of many eyes is with us again. A small bend, seen by one, noted by two, carried by three, begins to stand. Why mind a bend this small? Because materials that have slept in deep cold tend to answer with fine gestures before they answer with large ones. And those gestures, collected and compared, mark thresholds, where sunlight, dust size, and viewing geometry trade the lead, without raising their voices at all. A series of gentle deviations can teach more about grain sizes and surface patches than any single flare, and the confidence that comes from multiple instruments is not loud. It is precise, and you can feel it in your shoulders when the last check mark is set beside the last correction, because then the night's hinge clicks, and the curve's quiet inflection becomes a shared note that persists after the last frame is written to the disk. So the inventory matters, and the order in which we listen matters too. We ask the wide fields what they saw and when. We ask the small scopes to lean closer and linger. We ask the spectrographs to hum the chord beneath the melody the photometers carry. We ask the atmosphere to step aside with the help of standards and care. The pit falls still. the baton rises, and for a moment the date, the instruments, and the traveller hold the same fraction of quiet in common. The stars seem brighter for that accord, though we know they are not. We simply notice the star glow linger at the edge of the dome and let it carry us into the next page. What does a cold surface feel when sunrise finds it after a very long night? The answer arrives in gradients, not in shouts. Sunlight slips across irregular ground, sinking faster into dark, porous patches and slower into bright, crusted ones. Heat seeps inward with a delay called thermal inertia, so noon at the skin is not noon a finger's breadth below. A thin layer warms, a deeper layer lags, and stress builds as each tries to expand on its own schedule. Nothing breaks apart here. Instead, the surface adjusts with tiny sighs you can only hear through a brightness curve that tilts by less than a whisper. Spin turns that sunrise into pattern. As the nucleus rotates, regions with different textures and volatiles take turns facing the sun, and each region answers with its own small signature. Some reflect more. Some loosen dust more easily. The result at our distance is modest, a slow undulation in the light curve with hints of period, hints of shape, hints of a patchwork that repeats until the viewing geometry changes. We can infer rotation periods from these rhythms, comparing peaks and troughs over nights and seeking the simplest fold that aligns them. We do not demand an exact number tonight. We let the curve imply cadence while we rest in the knowledge that spin, like breath, gives structure to the glow. Heat and spin together make the skin of this traveller a living map. A warmed patch may open a microfracture, a tiny seam along an old grain boundary, releasing dust that was content to lie still until the rise in temperature unseated it. The gas that lifts the dust is mild, more a hush than a draught. The dust is fine, a flower that brightens the coma by a small, clear amount before radiation pressure persuades it to drift. When the patch rotates out of the sun, the seam cools and the contribution wanes. The behavior is local, repeatable, if the patch returns under similar conditions, and entirely consistent with materials that have slept in deep cold for ages. Geometry adds another layer of quiet complexity. Phase angle, the Sun-object-Earth angle, modulates how dust reflects toward us. At small angles, certain surfaces and powders can return light more efficiently. At larger angles, forward scattering by fine grains can lift brightness in a way that favors slightly redder or bluer bands, depending on size. None of this requires drama. A degree or two of change can nudge the curve by a fraction of a magnitude, especially if the spin happens to bring a more reflective patch into the sun just as the observing angle favors it. In that case, the tilt we measure is a duet, rotation carrying the motif, geometry tuning its color. Now, let the room go still. A lantern turns slowly on a hook, casting an oval that drifts across a wooden wall. The oval climbs a knot in the grain, finds a groove, and glides on. Floorboards keep their own soft clock. In the dome, a wheel ticks at a rate your pulse can match if you like, and somewhere a cable purls through a pulley with the easy confidence of a river. Air tastes faintly of dust and warm metal. Your breath takes its time. The lantern completes a lazy circle. The wall darkens. The hook rests. Local activity differs from global change, and the difference matters. Bright collimated jets, those narrow fans seen in some comets up close, are the work of strong, localized vents and favorable lighting. When distance blurs a traveler into a small bead of light, those fans if present at all, blend into a general softening of the coma unless the activity is unusually strong, and most nights it is not. Most nights it is a gradual veil that thickens and thins. So we read small bends as the surface telling us, in pieces, where powders are looser, where ice is more willing, where rotation presents a seam at just the moment when sunlight and viewing angle agree, and we keep the lesson humble because distance and resolution ask us to. There is a kind of timeliness to these effects that makes them memorable without making them urgent. A timeliness set by thermal diffusion depths and rotation, by the period with which a favoured patch returns to noon, by the hours it takes for heat to relax back into the cold below, so that the same little orchestra of causes, warming, seam opening, dust lifting, radiation pressure and geometry shifting, can play again if the lighting repeats and can fall silent if the path and angle move on, leaving only a faint record in the curve and a gentler coma in the images that follow. The slow swivel continues. The skin forgets its noon. The night regains its hold. To bring it together, think of the traveller as a turning lantern with a textured shade. Heat is the lamp inside, stronger as distance shrinks. Spin is the slow rotation. The shade has thin spots and thicker ones, and the wall around it is our sky. As the lantern turns, some thin spots let through a little more light. Others briefly shed a dust of ash that the room's faint air rearranges. We watch the wall, not the lamp, but the patterns we see there can still teach us how the shade is built. The curve we keep is that wall's record, a gentle archive of heat, spin, and skin adjusting to morning in a realm where mornings take their time. We end as the dome dims a notch, instruments finding their steady exposure again after a small correction, the date still tucked into the margin, the curve returning to its earlier slope. Nothing insists. Nothing hurries. The dimmer slides a little toward night, and we let the lesson rest with it. On the screen, the plot looks like a quiet afternoon. A thin line walks from left to right, tidy points lying close as if listening. Midway, the slope eases, not like a step, not like a jump, but like a hand relaxing on a pencil. The bend is small. In light curve language, it is a change in gradient over a brief span, a modest departure from the earlier fit that then returns toward it. We are not watching a spike or flare. We are seeing a fine graphite notch, the sort that appears when the wrist pauses and then resumes, leaving a mark you notice only when you lean close. This is what a bend means here, a short-lived adjustment in brightness rate, not a verdict, not a shout. To treat it properly, I set it beside the days before it. Baseline is the brace behind any claim, and baseline comes from overlap. Multiple nights, similar apertures, similar bands, similar ways of handling the sky. I overlay earlier curves, each with its dates and filters tucked in the margin, and I ask for sameness before difference. The earlier lines hold steady within their scatter. Small nightly offsets, yes, but no coordinated tilt at that time marker. In the logs that riders across the world submit with their careful timings, the cadence and conditions are written in the same clipped grammar. Together, they say that nothing unusual visited that minute on the previous nights. The bend belongs to this date, to this run, and still it is modest. The next step is housekeeping. I check the instrument's dark frames and bias frames for quiet, the flats for evenness, the nightly extinction for air mass well behaved. I ask whether a focus correction fell close to the bend. I look at the aperture used and confirm that a small change in seeing did not nudge the fraction of light captured. I ask if color terms were applied, if comparison stars were stable, if background windows were free of faint field ghosts. This is the practice that lets small numbers breathe without being mistaken for the weather of the camera. It takes only a moment to see that the pipeline held. The curve's notch is not an artifact I can erase with a calibration brush. It remains after the room is tidied. Now the room itself asks to be heard. Let the monitors dim in your mind, the keys cool under your palms. A pencil rests near a pad where a sketched axis waits for one more line. Outside the dome, frost softens the gravel, and somewhere a fox steps twice and vanishes. The air inside smells faintly of graphite and warm dust. The chair sighs when you shift your weight, and the clock, old and square, keeps a delicate beat behind the hum of the drives. You draw a short stroke. The graphite leaves a darker touch at its end, a small flourish where your hand slowed. You lift the pencil and watch the line settle into the page. The page holds the mark without insisting on a meaning. The night holds too. Back to the spectrum under the curve. If dust changed, the continuum should carry the story across broad bands. If certain gases joined in, particular regions would lean more. I compare the modest photometric bend with any spectra that skirt the same hour. The lines that mark common cometary molecules remain at their previous hush, while the dust-dominated slope shows a barely fuller coat of light, especially where small grains reflect best, and that pattern whispers dust rather than gas. The whisper is faint, but it is consistent. And consistency at this scale is what we honour with a nod and a note, rather than with proclamation. I list candidates and rank them by plainness. First, rotation. A patch that warms easily could have turned into sunlight and freed finer grains for a while. The timing favours this if the bend sits near a repeating light curve phase. Second, viewing geometry. A small change in phase angle can help forward scattering by tiny particles, lifting brightness by a hair without adding material. Third, a mild rearrangement from solar wind conditions that leaned the dust tail, altering what the aperture collects. Reorganization is gentler and likelier than production when spectra are quiet. Fourth, a subtle shift in grain size distribution. A pinch more sub-micron dust would brighten broadband flux briefly before radiation pressure spreads it thin. None of these is the only explanation. Together, they make an adequate domestic family of causes, the sort a working curve adopts on ordinary nights. Why does the exact minute help? Because clocks let causes cross-check. Coordinated timestamps, trimmed to seconds in UTC, make it possible to compare sites without sliding points along the axis to force agreement. They allow us to consult space weather indices for the same window, to align the object's predicted rotation phase, to compute the phase angle change across that hour, and to confirm that exposures did not march into twilight or through air mass limits. A bend pinned to a clean minute is easier to test against the quiet machinery that lives outside the telescope. Time standards, ephemerides, solar monitors, so that our inference is not only gentle, but also properly fenced. Sometimes the simplest picture is the truest. I imagine a compact dark nucleus turning, one hemisphere a patchwork of powders. Shallow seam warms, breathes out a thin mix that lofts fine grains, and a simple, broadband brightening follows. A minute later, rotation continues, the seam cools, the release declines. Radiation pressure and geometry take up their steady roles, and the curve returns to its broader slope, as if the pencil's small hesitation had been smoothed by the next stroke. The image is calm, not required, and used only to keep my choices orderly. It costs nothing, and it misleads no one, because the data stay in front and the picture trails behind, like a coat quietly carried on the arm. I save the page with its fine graphite notch and write the notes that will matter to anyone who reads it later. Band passes, apertures, air mass, extinction, filters, exposure times, comparison stars, any spectra within reach, the ephemeris and geometry at that exact minute, and the agreement level between sites. Then I let the screen go dark, as if a velvet curtain fell over a small, satisfying stage. The line remains in memory and in the archive. The night draws breath. We step away without losing the thread, and the blackout feels less like an ending than like a soft hand over the lamp. Begin with two kinds of paths. Bound paths are ellipses that close on themselves, returning season after season to the same longitudes of sunlight. Unbound paths are hyperbolas that do not close, their arcs opening away from the sun, so that the traveller passes once and keeps its promise to keep going. The dividing line is simple to state and gentle to think about. When the eccentricity is greater than 1, the energy relative to the sun is positive, and the object is not held. When it is less than 1, the energy is negative, and the object is kept. The difference is all geometry and gravity, but it feels, from here, like choice. Zoom out a little. A hyperbolic path carries a small extra speed that doesn't fade even very far from the sun, a surplus called the hyperbolic excess. It is not a roar, it is a whisper that never quite goes to zero. That surplus makes the path an open arc, the kind you can draw on a linen star map with a clean, continuous line that leaves the page at the edge instead of circling back. With such a path, there is only one chance to listen carefully as the traveller crosses the inner light. That is why we mark dates and keep cadence. We are watching a story that does not plan a second chapter in our sky. Pause with me and let the ambience widen. The room is dim, the dome slit a quiet seam in the dark. A paper map lies unrolled, its weave smooth under your fingertips, a pale grid catching a wash of red light. You trace the open arc with one fingertip, following the curve towards the sun and away again. Somewhere a small fan turns with a soft susurrus. Cables settle, then settle again. Outside, frost silver leafs the handrail. A moth finds the night and keeps it. The horizon holds like a calm pain, and for a minute the universe feels cotton soft, exact. Back to the numbers that make the map. An orbit is not guessed, it is solved. Observers mark positions against background stars and pass them to clearinghouses that keep time precisely. A first fit is made, then refined as more nights arrive, each new point tugging the parameters towards smaller residuals. Least squares methods balance all the pulls at once, assigning weights for uncertainties so that a clean average path rises from the small, stubborn noises of weather and optics. As the solution settles, an ephemeris is born, and the world has a schedule for pointing. When you know the schedule, you can plan to catch the hour when heating rises fastest, and when geometry may lend an extra shimmer to a light curve. The open arc is not immune to nearby gravity. Planets and their tides fold a little torque into the traveller's motion as it passes, deflecting the path by amounts that might be tiny in angle and still large enough to matter for a night's prediction. A massive planet can impart a measurable twist. A small one might only lean the solution by less than a degree. None of this implies capture when the energy stays positive. It just means that the linen line we draw needs to bend in the right place. And we ask trusted tools to compute that bend so the telescope arrives where the object will be, not where a straight edge would lead. Sometimes the path carries more than gravity. When fine gas escapes a surface and pushes dust, the nucleus can feel the faintest recoil. The effect is small and, on most nights, arguable. Yet, it is real enough that dynamicists keep special terms in their equations to allow for such whispers. Those terms act along the sun, across the motion, and out of the plane, tiny accelerations that let a curve fit better than gravity alone. On some visitors, they are plain. On others, they fall below the night's sensitivity. In all cases, the method is the same. Try a gravitational solution, check the residuals, add the non-gravitational family of terms only if they bring the residuals down without inventing drama. Put these pieces together, and a path emerges that is at once simple and precise. A solution that knows where the traveller was on each measured night, and where it will be on the nights to come, while allowing for small, physical freedoms that dust and gas can impose as the object tastes sunlight more strongly toward perihelion, drifts through the lightest touch of planetary pulls, and then coasts outward again along its open arc that never closes over our heads and never pretends to be a loop. There are precedents that help the mind settle. One interstellar visitor rode an open arc that hinted at extra push not fully captured by gravity, drawing careful studies that weighed surface physics against every other idea. Another arrived wearing a more familiar dusty shawl, its activity and trajectory fitting comfortably within expectations, for a cold body that warms and releases fine grains near the sun. In both cases, the label open arc turned speculation into work. You could compute where they would be, and then go and look, and what you saw matched the linen lines stamped into the ephemeris. Agreement allowed curiosity to be precise rather than loud. Now link the path to the warmth that shapes our small bend in brightness. As the traveller descends the inward branch of its hyperbola, sunlight grows with the square of closeness. The surface approaches a higher noon. If a rotation phase brings a sensitive patch to face the light at the same time that the geometry between sun, traveller, and earth favours forward scattering, the curve we keep can lean for a while, then ease back as the patch rolls away, or as the distance grows again. A path that does not close still has choreography. Perihelion is the stage's centre. The rest are measured steps toward and away from it. Because there is only one pass, we read the page with care. Each night's point is a bead on a line that will not be restrung. We refine the orbit while we can, test for tiny non-gravitational nudges if the residuals suggest them. Compare timing with any modest changes in brightness, and separates the roles of heating, spin, and perspective. The satisfaction here is domestic. We are not chasing crisis. We are practicing the craft of fitting motion and light into the same calm narrative, without forcing either to say more than it means. Hold the map again in your hands. The cloth has a faint coolness, and the inked arc glides across constellations like a river that only touches our shore once. It is enough. We watch from the window of night as the traveller enters the pane and leaves it, and in that passage, the small bend we noted finds its place amid motion that is clear and measured and sure. The window goes dark at the edges. A star reflects in the glass. The night window holds a moment longer, then loosens its grip. I keep a slow gallery in mind, frames on a quiet rail, earth-made and space-borne, each one a small square of borrowed night. Ground images carry the atmosphere's texture, gentle blurring from turbulent layers that turns every point of starlight into a soft kernel. Space images arrive sharper, untroubled by air, their stars tighter, their halos thinner. Neither is better for everything. Each has its honesty. On Earth, cadence is easier. In orbit, detail keeps its edge. Together, they build a picture that feels complete, without trying to be loud. A faint silver wash seems to hover between them, as if the night had brushed on a glaze. Let the room slip into a dark room hush. Red light lifts a low halo from the walls. Trays sit still. No liquid moves, yet your ears insist they hear a distant, patient drip. Paper curls a little at the corners, as if remembering humidity from a former life. Vent fans whisper with the steady calm of sleep. You place a new frame under the light and watch tones assemble at a pace the breath can match. Shadows arrive. First, midtones next, and finally the pale threads where dust softens a star's edge. You wait, you lift, you let the image rest on a wire. The air smells of cool metal and cardboard. A door husks shut. The gallery deepens. Filters give images their speaking parts. A blue-green band is sensitive to small grains scattering sunlight. A red band notes larger grains more kindly. Near-infrared reaches a little deeper into warmth. Space telescopes often render false color by mapping measured bands to visible hues, so our eyes can compare structures cleanly. The colors are chosen, not guessed. They carry meaning without pretending to be a direct photograph of what a human eye would see. On the ground, surveys step through standard filters as their patrols allow, and follow-up glass picks a narrower palette to examine a detail suggested by the patrol. When an image set shows the same, small enhancement in bands that favor fine dust, that hint leans toward dust, rather than gas. When only certain lines brighten, spectra take the lead and images nod along. Tails tell different stories depending on what moves them. Dust tails bend under radiation pressure. Particles large and small separate by how strongly light urges them outward. Ion tails, by contrast, are plasma banners that remember the magnetic field flowing past with the solar wind, often pointing more nearly away from the sun in crisp, narrow strokes. In some frames, the two lie together as layered script, dust wide and soft, ions thin and precise. Over the quiet period around our marked date, dust geometry can shift modestly if fine grains briefly become more numerous, while an ion tail might keep its own counsel, aligned to field lines that care little for dust. We look for that composure. Dust relaxing into a slightly altered poise, ions holding their strict line. A measured image is not just a picture. It is a table of counts you can read with care. Differential photometry takes an aperture, an invisible circle, places it on the traveller, places twin rings on comparison stars, and sums the light within, subtracting background taken from a gentle annulus around each target. The method resists mood. It simply totals. On moving objects, we align along the predicted path so the aperture walks with the traveller. Then we repeat in each filter and each frame. If the counts rise in more than one band, while comparison stars remain steady. The increase belongs to the object. If the shape of the coma leans in a direction the wind and viewing geometry can explain, we add a small note and keep the main conclusion in quiet type. Resolution sets our expectations. At many millions of kilometers, a jet like the needlework seen by close probes blurs into a faint asymmetry, and several tiny jets would fold together until they hide inside a general softening. Telescopes on the ground, softened by seeing, and telescopes in space, bounded by pixel scale and distance. Both devote their sharpness to the task, but cannot conjure filaments made too small by range. So an image that shows no dramatic spines is not arguing against activity. It is simply saying that any activity is distributed or fine or both, and that what the detector truthfully records is a roundness shading into a teardrop that answers sunlight, radiation pressure, and the slow drift of dust. Even so, imagery carries nuance no curve alone can hold. A slightly wider coma in the sunward quadrant on the same night as a modest photometric bend, a gentle shift in the brightest isophote toward the favored scatter angle, a tiny elongation that fades in later frames. All of these are quiet agreements with the numbers. You can stack the images before and after the minute we marked and blink between them. The change appears as a small, honest difference, not a flourish. Spectra remain calm, suggesting dust rather than gas took the stage for that hour. The sum is a triangle of evidence, photometry, spectroscopy, imaging, whose sides are short but equal enough to stand. There is comfort in the way these pictures breathe. From Earth, they breathe with the slow, soft lung of seeing, a point spread function that widens and narrows as the high air flows. From space, they breathe with the rhythm of orbits and exposures as detectors sip light to stay within their gentle wells, and the long, clean lines of stars keep their size from frame to frame. And across both, the traveller's glow ebbs and swells almost imperceptibly, a faint silver wash that thickens and thins as dust rearranges, then settles, then rearranges again, like tide on a beach so shallow that the water only shivers instead of rushing. So the gallery serves as texture, not verdict. It tells us the coma stayed modest, that no coarse fragments announced themselves, that dust carried the conversation while gas listened from the wings, and that the small brightening we counted is mirrored by a shape that leans just slightly, then lets go. We file each frame with its band, exposure, scale, and time, and we let the set live beside the curves and the lines. The chapter ends with images closed, like a portfolio after dusk. Edges square, corners neat, colour still drying into a calm that asks for nothing more. Low tide settle. Listen first. A hush like distant surf moves across the cables, a murmur in the dome that you can feel more than hear. The night is steady, and somewhere the sun is singing. No sound, only a river of particles that never sleeps. That river is the solar wind, a thin outflow of ions and electrons streaming from the hot crown of the sun into every quiet corner of space. It has a speed, a density, and a temperature that drift with solar moods, yet even on ordinary days it arrives on time. It is not a gale in our instruments. It is a soft push felt by things that can listen. Magnetism gives the wind its grammar. Threaded through the flow is the interplanetary magnetic field, a set of lines carried outward by rotation and wind together, curved like a loose spiral the farther they go. plasmas remember those lines. Ion tails of comets do too, arranging themselves along the field with a discipline that dust cannot match. When the field swings, the ion tail pivots. When the wind speed changes, brightness and length respond as the supply of charged particles shifts. Dust, by contrast, answers more to light's pressure and to its own release. The wind can still lean the dust's posture at the edges, gently, briefly, by influencing the gases that escort those grains. Thus, two tails may share a sky and obey different conductors. Let the room fall into a slow, airy minute. Imagine an Aeolian harp on a windowsill, strings crossing a hollow frame. Breeze moves through the strings without fingers, and tone appears from nothing but motion and tension. You do not force the song, you wait for it. A moth bumps the glass, wanders off. The rafters give a faint tick, then another. Under the hush, a far transformer hums, and your own breath slows to meet it. The harp answers when wind and string agree. It falls quiet when they do not. The instrument is the room. The room is an instrument. The soft push finds its level and holds. Moderate fluctuations in the wind are common, and, most nights, unremarkable. Indices on Earth record them in clipped numbers, and monitors far upstream sample speed, density, and field orientation, so we can know what kind of space weather is inbound. A modest rise in speed, a small change in field direction, a pocket of denser flow, each can matter for plasma structures. For the traveller's dust, the effects are subtler. The coma's brightest contour might lean a little, the tail's edge may smooth or roughen, an ion ribbon could jog, keeping time with the field's turn. None of this means new material appeared. It means arrangement changed with the airless breeze and then relaxed. That distinction, redistribution versus production, keeps the story sleep-soft and honest, because radiation pressure and gravity do most of the work moving dust, while the wind and its field conduct the gases that can paint narrower features. And on a calm night, when spectra do not show a fresh chorus of molecular bands, the slight brightening we measured sits more comfortably with a reshaping of existing grains, plus a small, rotation-driven release, than with any sudden manufacture of dust by the wind alone, which is why the bending of the light curve holds near together with a gentle nudge in the coma's shape, and a steady, almost indifferent ion component that mines its own magnetic road. Time adds another layer of ease. Dust motions, once nudged, take minutes to hours to display and to settle, depending on grain size and where they begin. Ions can answer faster, their streamlines tied to the field like thin silk that flips when the breeze veers. So a brief increase in wind speed might stretch an ion tail within a handful of frames while dust barely notes the event. Then, later, after rotation has warmed a seam and radiation pressure has had its say, the dust's map shifts by a degree, and the light curve leans by a fraction before smoothing back toward the old slope, all of which makes perfect sense when the orchestra is small and the conductor prefers pianissimo to forte. Instruments make this readable. Upstream monitors report the wind's approach. Ground magnetometers give the surface a small compass for the field's mood. Images and curves do the rest. If the moment of our modest bend coincides with a gentle uptick in wind speed and a slight change in field direction, the ion tail's behavior will reflect that. If the spectra stay quiet, while the broadband counts rise across more than one filter, dust is still the best narrator. with wind and field playing supporting parts that ask the coma to lean, not to erupt. When the timings do not match, we separate the causes and keep both notes in the margin. None of this is a storm chasing us. It is the steady hum of weather that space always keeps, and to which fragile grains are politely sensitive. The traveller's dust veil adjusts its poise. The ion ribbon remembers its lines. The curve bends and returns. We keep the Aeolian harp nearby in the mind, a reminder that motion can write music without raising its voice. The dome's fans exhale, cables sigh. Far away, the sun continues to sing in particles that no ear can hear. The distant hum thins as the minute passes, and when it fades, the numbers keep their shape. Distant hum. Names can feel like headlines, yet in astronomy they are really tools. At a quiet library desk in my mind, I set a small card beside each fact, a small cloth label sewn by careful hands. The label does not shout. It helps us file and find. A traveller in the dark earns its earliest label from where and when it was noticed, not from what it will one day turn out to be. That is housekeeping, not prophecy, and it keeps the shelves in order while curiosity does its work at a calm pace. Provisional designations come first, shaped by date codes and a simple alphabet that rolls forward as discoveries accumulate. An object that looks stellar and shows no coma can carry an asteroid-style tag at the start. One that clearly grows a fuzzy dress may wear a comet tag instead. All of it is provisional until enough positions are measured and enough nights are stitched together to solve a path. If that path proves hyperbolic after careful checks, eccentricity greater than 1, a sustained excess speed that resists better gravitational fits, then a different cupboard opens. The minor planet center keeps that cupboard. When consensus forms, the label Interstellar appears in the designation itself. It has happened before. A quiet speck first logged as an A was renamed the first of its class. A later fuzzier visitor, already recognized as a true comet, became the second. The labels did not make them what they were. They described what the numbers had already said. Surveys and pipelines feed those labels with steadiness rather than drama. A name like Atlas or ZTF or Pan-STARRS does not belong to a rock. It belongs to an array and a workflow. The optics, cameras, code, cadence, and people who look after the night so faithfully that moving points betray themselves. The survey patrols, the patrol reports. From there, others track and refine, passing their own measurements to the same clearinghouse. The object acquires many fingerprints and one shared file. No survey owns a traveller. The sky stays open to every patient lens, and names collect like tidy stamps that show the path of a parcel through careful hands. Now the room turns to ambience. Think of a broad reading room at dusk. Lamps make puddles of amber on green glass. A librarian smooths a corner of paper and lets it go. Pages breathe in slow riffles as someone far down the row closes a volume shaped like a star atlas. The air smells faintly of linen and dust. You slide a drawer and hear brass whisper on wood. Inside, labels wait in neat stacks, each with a thin cotton thread. A clock in a high case marks the minute and then forgets it. The floor holds still. Your breath finds an easy length. The drawer settles back. The label you need sits under your palm. The letter I in a designation is a category, not a trophy. It tells us that the dynamics argue for an origin beyond the sun's keep, and that multi-station astrometry and sober orbit solving have carried that argument past the first hurdle of excitement into the steadier hallway of consensus. Before that moment, different labels can visit the same object honestly, each reflecting what has been seen so far. One early visitor was logged as a nondescript fast mover before its path, cleaned and checked, made the open arc plain. The label changed because the math required it. Another arrived already wearing a comber and a tail. As confirmation grew, its tag inherited the same eye that places it in the same cabinet. In both stories, the number followed the evidence, and the evidence followed cadence, calibration, and time. Why care even when a cabinet door has not yet been opened? Because the physics does not wait for the label. A small, well-timed bend in brightness teaches about grains and seams, whether or not a new letter is sewn to the card. Imaging and spectra either agree or decline, and that lesson stands on its own feet. A gentle shift seen across filters still whispers about forward scattering and size. A quiet continuum without bright bands still points to dust over fresh gas. A returning rhythm still hints at rotation, and geometry still tunes how the light comes home. The label helps us file the notebook. It does not add a gram to the data. A night spent measuring a modest, honest change is never wasted, and a night spent checking the change and finding none is equally useful. Both tighten the net of understanding around material that is happiest to talk in small voices. And across years, it is those small voices, accumulated on shelves, that change the way we think. Media love a name because names travel fast. Method keeps the room warm because method travels true. We can hold both without conflict. Let the headlines flutter on their own wind. Our glossary belongs to the desk. A survey label means this instrument found it first on this cadence. A provisional tag means we have a timestamp and a sky patch. A permanent number means the orbit has been solved enough to trust. An interstellar mark means the path does not close, and we checked with care. Between those rungs there is only work, and the work tastes of patience. A dozen stations submitting positions, a dozen lines of code mending bias and flats, a dozen checks against timing and geometry and space weather, until the shelf gains one more card and the drawer closes, gentle as a book set down after midnight, with a hand that knows the page will be found again. So we keep our glossary friendly and our corrections soft. Call the traveller by the label it has today, and hold a corner of thread for the label it may carry tomorrow. File images under their filters and times. File curves under their apertures and air. File spectra under their bands and their hush. Interstellar is a room sign, not a drum roll, and rooms are for study. The drawer slides home. The green lamps dim a notch. The library desk is clear, but for a single card that reads what the numbers allow and nothing more. Hush hold. Across the night there is a soft procession of partners, each holding a lantern whose beam overlaps the next. Agencies that mind the day also mind the dark. NASA and ESA keep mirrors in space and archives on the ground. National observatories, universities, and citizen scientists add steady hands and careful eyes. The Minor Planet Center keeps the ledger, so positions do not lose themselves in the shuffle. No one owns the sky. The chain is long and lit by a linked glow, each lamp feeding the next without fuss. It is the ordinariness that makes the work strong. Data moves in rhythms that feel like breathing. Patrol surveys sweep and post. Then smaller teams home in and send their reductions in neat, standard formats. The ledger answers with circulars and updates written in a language that wastes no ink. When an object changes in any honest way, those notes travel quickly. Not like a rumour, but like a schedule pinned to a corkboard where anyone doing the work can find it. The point is not secrecy. The point is reproducibility, so that one group's night can become everyone's morning, and a gentle bend in brightness can be checked rather than celebrated. Between the models and the lenses, there is a loop made of patience. Predictions descend from ephemerides, telling us where to look and how fast the traveller will slide. Through the frame, observations climb back up and tug the numbers tighter, shaving residuals until the predicted and the seen are close enough to guide the next night's pointing. Close enough, not perfect. The loop respects the small freedoms of dust and the small liberties of weather. It is a handshake that keeps being offered and almost always accepted, until the path and the light agree to a quiet degree. Part of the craft is knowing what to set aside. Many checks return with nothing new to say, and that is not failure, it is scaffolding. A null result becomes the frame that holds the one frame with a difference. When a light curve is level on nights around a mild bend, those level lines give the bend its contour. When spectra are steady, while broadband flux leans, that steady spectrum is the reference that dust uses to speak. Archives do this silently, shelves of smooth nights holding up the one that carries the small change we care about. Let the ambience rise for a breath. Picture a chain of lanterns along a path at dusk. Each one pulls a circle of amber on gravel, and the circles overlap. You can walk without staring at your feet. In a window nearby, a screen glows with a plot where points gather politely. A second window shows a line of terse messages, time-stamped and even-tempered. A third lists exposures waiting in the queue. A kettle sighs. The room smells faintly of warm dust and a trace of tea. Outside, the night keeps its slow, easy sway. The lanterns hold their linked glow and ask nothing more of you than steady steps. A single date helps the steps find cadence. Time stamps allow everyone to lay their pieces on the same line, so a small bend seen in multiple bands can be compared to the rotation phase predicted that hour, to the phase angle changing with geometry, to upstream space weather notes, to seeing an air mass written into logs. With time stitched cleanly, causes can be separated instead of stacked, and the quietest explanation can take the front chair. Rotation bringing a fragile seam to noon, dust reflecting a little more under a favoured angle, the solar wind asking the coma to lean but not to speak louder. And then, because the minutes are labelled, the curve slips back toward its older slope, and the pages around it tell the same story without confusion. All of it becoming a small, sufficient lesson that travels well from one lamp to the next without losing colour or line. The network deserves a soft thanks at the end of this page, for the surveys that kept cadence while clouds wandered, for the small telescopes that nudged exposures until the target sat just right, for the ledger that arranged timestamps and names so our notes could find one another, for the modelers who turned those notes into pointing that worked, and for the archivists who will make this modest bend easy to find long after we have forgotten which night we watched it. The chain holds because each keeper tends one light and trusts the next. We leave the room with that faith intact. The screens dim, the last plot cools to grey. The colours of the night dissolve into one another, and the glow thins to a calm, shared dusk. Let me set the bench light low and lay out the pieces like tools. 1. Materials that have slept near absolute winter are touchy in the best, most informative way. Warm them by a few degrees and they answer with fine gestures, dust eased loose, reflectivity nudged, well before they offer any loud response. 2. Dust doesn't wander at random. Its paths can be drawn. Light urges small grains, gravity holds larger ones, and families of curves trace where each size prefers to go. 3. When a surface releases even a breath of gas, the body feels a whisper of recoil, measurable only when the fit is very clean. 4. Other travellers have shown how these notes combine, each in its own key. 5. Our reach grows. The next visitors will be found earlier and followed longer. 6. The moral is domestic and durable. Small tells teach steady lessons. First, the tender physics. Ultra-cold regolith and ices behave like coiled springs hidden under frost. A shallow gradient of heat relaxes them. Patches soften. Porosity and grain boundaries offer seams where a trace of gas can lift fine particles. We learned this up close when a long-lived probe kept watch on a rough, dim nucleus and saw how sunlight infiltrated by millimeters and centimeters, how temperature and texture refused to rise in lockstep, and how dust left quietly when the difference between skin and subsurface grew. Laboratory analogues, cooled and warmed in disciplined cycles, show the same family of behaviors. Microfractures that open and close, cohesion that falls with a small dose of energy, and dust that answers before bulk changes do. None of this is rare. None of it needs grandeur. It is the physics of chill materials put gently into day. Second, the pathways of dust. To see where grains go, I sketch 2 kinds of guides: synchronies, lines of equal release time, and syndines, lines of equal grain size response. Together, they make a net. Fine grains, urged strongly by light, fan wider and sooner. Coarser grains hang closer, their arcs thicker and slower. When the coma brightens by a hair and the sunward profile relaxes into a slightly broader shoulder. This net tells us which sizes would make that shape at that distance and hour. And when the tail's edge leans by a degree under constant light, the same net shows how earlier releases, still travelling, would contribute to the map we see tonight. It is a workshop drawing, not a painting, and the fine brass rule on the bench keeps the lines honest. Let the room settle into ambience now. The shop smells faintly of pine shavings and cool metal. A soft lamp pulls a circle on a scarred tabletop. Calipers rest open beside a small ruler the colour of old honey. You run a finger along the rule's edge and feel the polished chill. Somewhere a kettle clicks and the element hums. A pencil rolls, then stops at the lip of a notepad. Dust in the beam floats like quiet snow. Your breath lengthens to meet the stillness. You align the edge, draw a slow line, and the graphite stays where you place it. The bench accepts the plan and says nothing more. Third, that faint recoil. When material leaves a body, momentum goes with it, and the remaining nucleus can feel an almost unprintable tug. In orbital fits, we leave room for 3 tiny accelerations, sunward, along track, and out of plane, so that a solution can improve if such a tug is truly present. Most nights, the parameters remain consistent with 0 within errors. Sometimes they trim the residuals by just enough to matter. A small bend in brightness that coincides with an even smaller improvement in such a term does not prove cause. It simply shows that the light and the path are willing to tell a single story when asked politely. The rule here is restraint. Add the terms only when the data ask for them, refuse them when they do not, and let the curve and the orbit agree to remain independent when that is the truest posture. Fourth, the precedence. One visitor argued with sunlight in an odd way, asking dynamicists to weigh subtle surface physics against everything else that could mimic the same effect. Another displayed a more familiar coma and tail, obeying well-worn expectations for a dusty traveller whose interior had begun to breathe. Both were watched by many eyes and many methods, and both taught us how small, time-bound features in a light curve, in a spectrum, or in an image, can be braided into a model that is unexcited and exact enough to guide the next night out. When you set our modest bend beside those histories, it fits on the same shelf, a measured, limited deviation that points at material and geometry, rather than at mystery. Fifth, the horizon. Discovery is changing shape. Patrols are wider, cameras quicker, pipelines cleaner. A new observatory with a vast eye is nearly ready to keep a film of the whole accessible night, revisiting fields with a cadence that turns rare events into routine entries. That means we will meet more travellers in the act of being ordinary, and our notebooks will thicken with small bends like this one. Moments when rotation, light, and dust choose a slightly different arrangement, teach a small lesson, and move on. Earlier, discovery also means longer arcs for orbit solving, better constraints on any whisper of non-gravitational push, and more nights to cross-check colour, morphology, and spectra. The brass rule will earn its keep. Now the synthesis, and I will keep it plain. The bend we tended is a measure of sensitivity. It says fragile stuff answers gently, and that gentle answers can be measured. With the dust net, we can say which sizes and release times best recreate the shape we saw. With careful orbit work, we can say whether the path needs the smallest help to match the points. With precedents nearby, we can say that this is the kind of quiet behaviour visitors have shown before. With better patrols coming, we can say we will catch more moments like this and place them in families rather than in isolation. From these pieces, we distill a rule you can hold in the palm of your hand, like that fine strip of brass. Respect small structure, because it carries the weight of inference without the weight of drama. One long breath more to place the morale where it belongs. We often hope for spectacle and end up given clarity. Clarity looks like a tenth of a magnitude that leans by a few hundredths for less than an hour, like a sunward isophote that rounds a touch, like a spectrum that stays quiet while the continuum fills by a hair, like an orbit fit that neither demands nor forbids a small extra term, and like a schedule of points that agree within clean uncertainties because their clocks were kind and their calibrations tidy. And though none of these would stir a headline on its own, together they make a benchtop lesson in how to listen, because when such modest features recur across instruments and nights, they add up to knowledge that arrives without fanfare, yet persists longer than anything sensational, precisely because it is repeatable, shareable, and patient enough to fold into models that keep working when the lanterns dim and when the traveller is only a memory of dust that drifted. So I slide the brass rule back into its slot, cap the pencil, and ease the lamp to a lower setting. The notes read cleanly. Dust first, rotation and geometry as partners, wind as a polite stagehand, orbit as a frame that holds, past visitors as tutors, future surveys as companions. The workshop is in order. The lesson is small and finished. Soft, hard cut. Far from the sun, brightness thins the way a tide recedes. Photons arrive fewer to each square of distance, and the traveller softens until its curve is mostly air, its points held together by patience and longer exposures. Signal yields to the rule that light falls off with distance, and dust adds its own drift, so what we measure is the mingled hush of less sunlight and slower release. We lengthen integrations, stack frames along the path, and accept a noisier edge, because fading is a kind of truth, too. The receding hush becomes the night's motif. It's not melancholy. It is the shape that a one-time visitor must keep. What remains is what we wrote down. Positions tucked into a ledger that never sleeps. Curves stored with their apertures, filters, and air mass as tidy footers. Images filed with scales and times. Spectra labelled by band and by the silence they kept. Archives stitch these together into something anyone can lift later. A table, a plot, a thin line that shows where the curve bent for a minute and where it smoothed again. Shelves like these, on mountain servers, in university rooms, behind quiet portal pages, do not need ceremony. They are drawers that open easily when a new traveller passes, and someone wonders whether the same kind of bend once lived at the same distance, under the same light. Inside the traveller, we do not claim recipes. What we have are ranges learned from kin that moved more slowly, and lingered near the sun long enough for probes to read their surfaces from arm's length. Porous crusts, patches richer in certain ices, dust that clumps or dust that powderizes, depending on how heat has threaded the interior and how cosmic rays have marked the skin. Some bodies breathe more when warmed, others keep their breath until noon is higher and nearer. Our visitor's modest change, timed to a patch of light and a turn and spin, sits comfortably among these possibilities. It offers permission to say fine grains took the lead for a little while, and then yielded that lead back to the older rhythm of geometry and distance. Speculation has a small chair at the table, and no more. If we make room for it, we let it sit within a single sentence. Perhaps the surface's upper millimeters carry alternating layers, dust that insulates lying above dust that lifts, so that a turn that looks ordinary from far away delivers a brief surplus of brightness when the thinner layer faces the sun. Or perhaps a seam opened and closed across a rotation, repeating once or twice before conditions changed. There is no need to reach past such domestic guesses. The data do not ask us to. Why nights like this soothe is easy to say quietly. The work is human-scaled. It is careful and unhurried. It doesn't mistake patience for weakness. To sit with a curve until its lean becomes clear is to practice an attention we can carry into other rooms when dawn arrives. To read a spectrum that stays calm is to relearn how silence communicates in a language we always had. To see a shape shift by a degree and then find its old center again is to remember that most change is reversible at first. The lesson belongs to sleep. Nothing urgent. Much to keep. Let the ambience open on a shoreline at dusk. Waves arrive thin and whole, then fold back, leaving a glassy trace you could write your name on if you liked. The wind is a mild seam between water and land. It carries salt, the way a whisper carries comfort. Footprints appear and soften. Far down the beach someone sets a lantern on a rock and turns the flame down until it is only a gold seed in a blue field. The horizon feels like a promise kept. A gull makes a single arc and disappears into the colour. You breathe in the faint iodine of seaweed and the calm of tide. The receding hush is everywhere and nowhere. The page holds still. In that hush, the traveller takes its leave. It will keep moving along its open arc until our instruments cannot find it, and then it will keep moving still, invisible to us, and perfectly real. We are not diminished by that. What we keep is enough. A date, a light curve bend measured across more than one band, imagery that leaned the same way for a night, spectra that stayed composed, a path solved from many hands, and then folded back into the daily work. The next time a visitor brushes the inner light, these pages will be waiting, their corners squared, their numbers legible, their pauses marked by small dots that say, breathe. So I close the ledger for now. I let the screens dim to a kindly grey. I set the pencil down where the graphite will not smudge the notebook's edge. The dome's slit narrows like a calm eyelid. Outside, the rails glitter with cold, and then stop glittering as a thin cloud takes the stars into itself. The traveller is already smaller than habit. It will be smaller still tomorrow. The shoreline in the mind holds a last faint tide mark and then erases it. The receding hush has done its work. Pillow close. We have walked a small arc together. One date, one clean bend, and a circle of patient instruments. Observers measured brightness against time, while spectra kept their gentle hush. Images leaned a little sunward, then relaxed. Across those rooms, the numbers agreed, without asking for noise. The path we traced was open, solved from many hands, refined until prediction and pointing met in the middle. Interstellar or not, the lesson held, fragile matter answers first with fine gestures, and fine gestures can be measured. Archives will keep the notes. Ledgers hold coordinates. Tables keep apertures, filters, and air mass. When we return, the page will open where we left it. The physics remains simple and kind, sunlight that falls off with distance, dust that listens to light more than to wind, rotation that carries a seam to noon and then away again. If a non-gravitational whisper belongs in the fit, it will ask politely and be admitted. If not, gravity is enough. I hope your breathing has found the pace of these lines. I hope the room is ordinary again, the sort of ordinary that makes sleep easy. The sky will keep its quiet work while you rest. Telescopes do not mind standing the night watch. Thank you for letting me keep the lantern low, for letting small signals be sufficient, and for sharing the patience that turns detail into comfort. Close your eyes when you're ready. The curve will be here in the morning. The tide will be soft and on time. Good night.